All right, I think that's running. Um, so let's go ahead and get started. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Just kind of use the chat if you're having difficulty with any audio or anything. And make sure you're all muted so that the only reason is I will listen. If you're about to, if you make noise, I'm gonna listen. I hope that's okay. And also, I hope that the transcription is also adequate, so everybody can get the transcription. And with that, I will get going. Okay, so this the subject of this module is computer and information security, and I wanted to go over some of the big ideas that make security work in information systems. And I don't want to talk about too many ideas. I just want to talk about the ideas that you guys can use on a day by day and a project by project basis, and the big ideas that kind of knit information security together. Now, the place that I want to begin is in the Roman Empire, which has a lot of commonalities to the world we live in right now. It's a very information intensive environment. The continuity of the empire very much depended upon messaging and information systems. Now, these are not digital information systems. They're messengers, they're postal, they're letters that people write to each other and they deliver by horse or by ship. And, from the time, before Christ, AD era on, this area of the world would be knit together very cohesively, and it maintained so for thousands of years. I'm not a Roman historian, but I do want to talk about the relevance of this kind of era in history to where we are right now, where frankly encryption is at the core of what we're able to accomplish. And if we have encryption, we're able to have privacy and secrecy, which is at the core, at the fundamentals of communication. It's at the fundamentals of what we do right now, and it's the fundamentals of what we did in a prior era as well. In the words of Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote Surveillance Capitalism, it's a very good book for you to look at, Shoshana Zuboff. Her message is that if you do not have privacy, you do not exist. The essence of humanity is privacy, and I found that interesting, coming from a fairly experienced and mature person. A lot of young people, and I think older people as well, they believe that as long as they have convenience, then they have nothing to hide. But that's the wrong spirit to have. I think that if people can find things out about you, then they can use that against you. If they can find that you belong to some organization, they can use that against you. If they find that you hold some kind of belief, even though it's a legitimate belief in your mind, they can use it against you. We are frankly a law and order society, and we take that for granted. We assume that is taking place. And so we figure that if we just remove some of the legal protections, then things will continue. But actually, we have we guard our privacy a great deal, and we also guard our right to communicate what's on our mind. What I find in the near term culture is that people are not tolerant of free speech. People are very suspicious of free speech, and they're very suspicious of the open exchange of ideas. So the notion of encryption just becomes richer as time goes on. So naturally, we're going to have to ask the question: could the Roman Empire achieve its historical identity, i.e., could it be an empire? Could it survive the test of time? Could it be millennia in age if it were not for their privacy systems? So what we understand is that the culture has continuity insofar as it has security and it has information integrity and secrecy. The technology that the Romans used was called a rote 13, and it stands for a 13 key cipher, and a cipher is a encrypted message. So what the Romans would do is they would take each of the letters, and that they would use a key of 13 numbers long, and the key would be used to transform letters into the appropriate message. So it's rote 13 because technically it should be a collection. It should be a wheel that can be turned 13 different ways in order to generate what's called a cipher, or to take a cipher, which is an encrypted message, and turn it into a decrypted message. So what you technically would do is you would take the key and then you would utilize the key to unpack or decode a message. And the message should, so if you imagine the number of laws and the number of policies and the culture that was normed across the Roman Empire, technically what the Caesars had to do is they had to originate a message here in the Latin side of the empire, in the Roman side of the Italian peninsula, and they would spread that message elsewhere, and they would make a single culture. And so the empire is as much about messaging and information secrecy as it is force of arms. You simply cannot operate a military/legal construct. You cannot operate a corporate enterprise if you do not have the ability to pass messages and maintain the secrecy of those messages. If you think about the Roman Empire in the context of a corporate or a business enterprise network, it's the perfect analogy. There's a Caesar or an imperial or a managerial core, and the manager is successful insofar as he or she can create a culture or a norm, a set of ideas, and then pass those ideas, and then everybody achieves unanimity with those ideas. If you lack cohesion, or if your ideas are not good, and then other people are unwilling to follow your ideas, then the unity of the empire or the corporation cracks. If there are other people who can intercept and prohibit the messages from moving, the empire cracks. If your antagonists or your enemies can discover your thought process, the empire cracks. So you'd have to make a ratio between the Roman Empire that we knew, which is the force of arms, the military engineering, the superb armies. I love this caricature. It's something my son would love. If you think about the Romans, they had to do quite a bit more than be a military force. They had to also be an administrative power, and they had to have a culture that the various locals would agree to. There would have to be a sense of democracy, and that you would have to care about the lives of the group that you colonized to the point where they would prefer your reign versus their own. And this is what characterized the Roman Mediterranean. Now, other regimes would form, and there would be other people who would not conform to the Roman rule. You would have the Germanic peoples who later would form the Holy Roman Empire, which formed as a kind of a deconstructive counterbalance to the Mediterranean powers. And eventually, the breadth of the empire would become impossible for it to remain unified. It just became too successful. So we talk about other empires, the Ottomans, they naturally replaced, they needed the footprint of the Roman Empire in order to organize itself. But naturally, the techniques of empire would be inherited by the Ottomans. They would, Ottoman is a much more modern empire that would survive into the 20th century. World War I would take apart the Ottoman Empire. It's a very long-standing empire. But also the Germanic empires were meaningful as they unified the countries to the north of the Roman Empire. So, the reason why I invoke the Roman Empire is that spiritually we inherit some of that spirit of empire, where the corporation, I asked this as a question, does the corporation inherit some of the thought process of empire? Does the corporation resemble empires in some way? The Russians, this profound empire to the north there. All of these spaces inherit the norms of imperial culture. The Romans bequeathed that organizational administrative culture to these other empires. I'm sorry, did someone want to ask a question? Yeah, no, that's a very, very good point. I think that, folks in Britain, were at some point colonized. The Britons, I'm not saying the British, but the ethnic Britons were under Roman rule. And there are portions of Britain that did inherit Roman culture. There are Roman ruins, there are gladiatorial remains in Britain. So that's very true. Now, the reason why I want to, and I appreciate your comment, I think you're right, you're right on. I'd love to get an image of that because now, if you think about what the British would require, the British had a force of arms. They had a massive military presence, and they also had to have an administrative presence, where it would not be enough for them to simply be decent warriors. That's not inadequate. The Grecians were excellent warriors, the Athenians, but they were not administrators and they were not imperial thinkers. The reign of Alexander the Great disappeared within 10 years of his death. And so it takes quite a bit more than just being a great warrior. It really takes being an administrator. And hence you think about the role of information systems. So I think a lot of the culture of encryption comes from that Roman cipher. And so, Vasha, you were mentioning the British. The close of the British Empire is World War II, and probably the survival of Britain was probably one of its last things that they ever did as a world power. I think the British Empire survives in many ways. In many ways, it's taken on different forms. You could argue it survives in the shape of finance, or maybe the Anglo-American presence is a continuation of that English Anglo-British culture. You could make that argument. But the reason why in the computer sciences field we have the figure of Alan Turing is he was a British computer scientist working in the 30s and 40s. And what he configured was a machine that was composed of a great deal of rote 13 ciphers that would mechanically try to decrypt German Nazi messages. And so you would bring a message that would be gobbledygook, that would be a cipher, to the rote 13. This is a good image. And he would actually construct a machine that was built of many, many wheels. Now, he was a mathematician and a very early contributor to computer science, but his idea was that if he would apply enough wheels and would rotate those wheels appropriately, they would come up with enough configurations to guess the encryption key to decrypt messages coming across the German front. Now, I think that there's an excellent museum. There's an excellent movie. I think it stars Benedict Cumberbatch, and it's I forget what it's called. I think it'd be wise for you to check it out. I was just thinking to myself that would be a good thing for you to look at. The Imitation Game, right? And what's good about this is they attempted to recreate the decryption machine, and they actually give a fair rendition of the machine in the movie. And what you have is a series of wheels. And it's a non-digital machine. It's an analog machine, but it is in fact a computer in that it tries to brute force what we would consider to be a brute force hack on the Nazi decryption messages. And so I think it's a decent story for us to look at. You can't depend on Hollywood for accuracy, but you can depend on Hollywood to suggest the difficulty of doing this and the impact of Turing's work. The Americans were also very busy at code breaking, and technologically, interestingly enough, the Americans were outgunned in the Pacific. Historians of the of the World War II Pacific War were very clear that the Americans had slow planes, they had slow ships, they had a slow navy, and they just barely overcame the Japanese when they fought them one on one. The Japanese had a very, very valid, very fresh, very domineering naval machine, and their armada was probably superior to that of the Americans, and probably the Japanese had a superior air force. Their planes were more sophisticated, they were much more technologically inclined, and the Japanese army was a much more viable army. Just looking at accounts of the American struggle in the South Pacific, it was an extremely close war. Now, America really prevailed in the South Pacific because they could decrypt about 10% of the Japanese messages. So there was very little decryption. There was very little encryption that was happening within the Japanese radio systems. So anytime the Americans could get in contact with the radio signaling from the Japanese, they could decrypt. And because of that 10 to 13% of the decryption, the Americans were able to understand their motives ahead of time. So the Americans prevailed against the Japanese, but the contest was so close. It was it's probably something we need to know. Now, naturally, the Americans did prevail, and winning by a small margin in war matters. Does that make sense? So what we have is the heritage of World War II is that you have Silicon Valley that is really inheriting the role as a defense electronics industry. And if you wanted to, really, California was chosen as a very low cost, very low risk place to locate the U.S. military's U.S. military contracting for defense electronics. So the internet was a university project that began in 1968 that was hoping to create a matrix or a topology of computers that would keep the American military operant in the case of a nuclear strike. The Defense Agency Research Projects Administration was funding high-level defense electronics at places like USC, MIT, predominantly Stanford, UC Berkeley, and University of Southern California were the recipients of the early development. And so the reason why I discuss the internet and the early development of the internet, it's really a post-Cold War. The Cold War was a very real warfare element, and we did not have the same kind of organized, army on army meeting as we did in the South Pacific or in places like North Africa or in places like Russia. We did not have army on army, but what we really did was have tactical maneuvers all over the world. So the Russians would locate missiles in the Caribbean. The Americans would locate missiles in Turkey. It was really a chessboard that was evolving, and the nuclear threat is it's as real now probably as it was then. But we simply did not have the détente with Maoist China the way we do now. We did not have a détente with the Russians as we do now. And in many ways, the Americans had to realign the Russian government. Leninist Russia was provocative. Leninist Russia was problematic. Rather, Stalinist Russia was problematic. Both of those powers were genocidal, and they were nuclear. They were a very reasonable enemy. And so you can say that World War II was the close of an era, but really it was the beginning of an era. And what you had is you had the close of hostilities with the Empire of Japan, but you had and with fascist Germany, but you had a continuity of struggle with our allies, with Russia, and ultimately communist China. who was a very severe enemy also, the Korean War. So you would finish World War II and you would enter into another 30 years of continuous war. So you would say that World War II finished, and that led 10 years later into the Korean Peninsular War. That was against Korea and China. And so the industry of defense electronics flourished amidst this unending series of hostilities. And our ability to stage radar, decrypted communications, long distance networks, it was an unending flow of financed military tech. And I think right now, we're experiencing the internet, and but it really, for a generation, that was a military project. Having the ability to have a digital, text-based communication environment across America, it was very much a nuclear preparation. It was a digital layer. So the reason why we bring that up is you have the ability to encrypt and to encrypt digitally post World War II. World War II is a era of code breaking and encryption. The Cold War is an era of the internet, and what was developed was the various applications that were running over the internet. Now, some of the key application protocols was one, the File Transfer Protocol, or FTP, Secure Shell, which is an encrypted text-based to manage other computers, Telnet, which is messaging, Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, which is mail, DNS, which is what you do to type, Amazon.com. You type Amazon instead of the IP address of Amazon. It has naming. DHCP, which issues IP addresses to computers within a local network. Hypertext Transfer Protocol, that is what you're using in order to load web pages on a non-encrypted basis. You have Secure HTTP, which is an encrypted version of HTTP. POP3, which is a simplistic version of the email that you use on your phones. That would be an email that you would go to a server and you would read messages on a server. What you guys have is called IMAP, which is an upgraded version where the messages are streamed down to your device, and they have the capabilities for media and HTML, etc. So all of these protocols were well known, and anybody could develop, for example, an IMAP application. Anybody could look at the code of Secure Shell and make additions. Anybody could take DHCP and they could make their own version of it. So all of these were open source applications. But the reason why I want to bring these up is they each occur over what's called a port number. So the port for Secure Shell is typically 22. Now you could run Secure Shell over different ports, but most machines are ready to accept Secure Shell traffic over port 22. Most computers are willing and able to get Hypertext Transfer Protocol traffic over port 80. Most computers are ready to accept secure HTTP over port 443. And because of those